I'll now ask Reverend David to expand on that meaning and explain its relevance to us in the modern world.
I'll do my best. I decided to take up the theme of maturity from these words of Paul's. We get a further insight into Paul's assessment of the Corinthian church in this passage, and on the most part, he doesn't suggest it's an example to be followed. He offers a number of illustrations of lack of maturity, in a sense, and there's hints about what we should expect from people who are mature and immature. There we go. Babies, they're cute, aren't they? Gotta love babies. There's some things that are really obvious about babies, and if you look closely at them, one of the things that's obvious about them is they can't chew because they don't have teeth. And so they survive on a diet that's mainly liquid to start off with. Breastfeeding, they have milk or bottle feeding with milk. Babies don't have the physical capacity to bite or chew their food. Their digestive processes are still developing, and so you'll know if you've had a baby in your presence, they sometimes get uncomfortable with wind and all sorts of stuff. I mean, that might happen to you too, but it's particularly prone to babies. And they tend not to be really interested in solid food because they can't chew it up, and indeed it becomes a choking hazard for them. If they get something solid and try to swallow it, they could end up blocking their airways. So for babies, it's appropriate to feed them milk. And anyone who tries to feed the baby something that's inappropriate is actually putting the baby's life in danger. So far I've taught you nothing, because you all know that, right? Okay. As we grow up, though, things start to change. There's so many different foods that we can eat. And it's really appropriate that as we grow, we explore different kinds of foods, different flavours, different textures, all that kind of thing. Whilst it would be foolish to offer an infant a piece of steak to tuck into because they don't have the capacity to do it, we also don't want to feed anybody milk for the rest of their lives because it's just not enough to sustain them. Their body wouldn't develop properly, their brain wouldn't develop properly. It doesn't have all the things that are needed for our growth as a human being. The introduction of solid food comes at the right time when there's a capacity to engage it and it's interesting, and anyone that's fed a child knows that kids are very expressive at this point. If they don't like something, often you end up wearing it. It's great fun, the game of trying to feed the baby and all the rest of it. But that's how we go. We explore and we start to grow, and we give our bodies what they need. But the church in Corinth are a bunch of babies. Now, Paul's being particularly pointed at this point because he's saying you were not spiritual. And he's actually responding, a number of people think, to the claim that the Corinthians made that they were incredibly spiritual. They thought they were the ants' pants of spirituality. And so Paul is saying to them, nah, not so much, because you're carrying on like babies, and I had to give you milk, not solid food. This is not a very flattering way to describe a bunch of people. Honest, at a stretch you might say it's cute, but it's not particularly flattering. Paul is making clear that the Corinthians are like babies in their faith. They are after the easily digestible and easily consumed milk. They don't want the challenging stuff. They're not ready to do the stuff that's about maturity. They are fascinated with things like a baby would be fascinated by things. Excuse me. Have you ever played peekaboo with a baby, a child? It's great fun, isn't it? You hide your face for a moment, you spring back, and they're delighted. It's so fantastic. Where did you go, and how did you come back so quickly? And the Corinthians were a bit like that with spiritual gifts. They wanted to speak in strange tongues and have magical insight into things and do all the magic kind of stuff that was kind of peekaboo-ish. And so they're very much like babies. Paul does not seek to feed the Corinthians anything too much because they're just not ready. And they need to know that because they're starting to think they're a bit better than they actually are. Now, it's not a slam down. He's not trying to put them down. He's trying to wake them up to the reality of what's going on so that they don't miss out on something good. For all their posturing, all their saying that they were really something special, Paul's saying, well, look at your behaviour. Look at what's going on here, because really it looks to me like you're still babies. So how do you know when someone's mature or immature? One of the things to look at is their focus. What are they focused on? If you read through the letters to the Corinthians, you get a kind of idea of what the Corinthians focused on, mainly because Paul is responding to it and saying, not so much this, not so much this, not so much this. And Paul responds to them by saying, don't get your identity caught up in all this magical stuff of how spectacular your gifts are, or how important you are, it seems, in the community, on all this kind of stuff. Don't worry about tongues and prophecy unless they're building the body. The tongues and the prophecy might be good, but they're only good if they're building the body. So if you're caught up with the actual expression, but you don't know what the expression is meant to do, that's immaturity. If you're caught up with the purpose of building the body, you will find any and every way to do that. That's the focus. That's maturity. In another place, Paul's talking about the weekly worship meal where they get together and they break bread, and some people were able to get there early and they were eating all the food. And they were the more powerful people because they weren't the slave class that had to stay and clean up their master's house or whatever and then sneak away and get to the worship meeting. And Paul's saying, don't eat all the food before everybody gets there. That's immature. Come on, build the body. And again, in different other places, we'll see Paul critique these non-central obsessions. The Corinthians obsessed over things that weren't central. And this is a sign that they were kind of like the baby who is surprised and wants to go after this and that and easily distracted. Paul's focus is consistently on what builds the body of believers, what makes us strong together, what's not just about you, but about us and about the world out there that we can engage with. Anything that does not contribute to that end simply is not central, and it's immature to get caught up with. Get really caught up with building the body, building what's good for all. We've already heard earlier on in this... gone too far again. Did I miss one? Oh, no, that's right. I'm tricking myself. Paul earlier on has had some words to say about unity. There was people going after Apollos, people going after Cephas, and people going after Paul. And Paul's already said, we're all following Jesus, remember? Who's Paul, who's Apollos, who's Cephas? And in this passage, one waters, one plants, one waters. We're all doing something, but it's for the greater purpose. And it's interesting to think about unity because often in our naivety, we think unity is about all being much the same. And it's not about being the same. That's unanimity, in a sense, or conformity. But when there is a unity of purpose, where each task is actually different and each person has different skills and gifts, and they offer their particular skills and gifts in the task, and then somebody else comes and offers their skills and gifts in the task. And no one person can do everything. But unless every person does their part, the whole thing doesn't work. So if there's no seeds put in the ground, it doesn't matter how good you are at watering. There'll be no plant. And if there's no one to water your seeds, it doesn't matter how many you put in the ground, they'll just stay in the ground and nothing will happen. We need every part to play its part. But that's hard for us. And it's really hard if you're not very mature, like a baby who just sees the face appear and then hides again, because we look at an image and we go, what's that? I'm just doing my little bit. What's that? And it's not until you get a sense of perspective that you kind of start to see, well, maybe that little bit that I'm doing is part of something that's a bit bigger. This is the more dangerous stage, because sometimes we think we know what's going on. And so we think we can work out how our part's really important and all that kind of thing. And there is a tendency at this point to overinflate ourselves, possibly. It's not until you get really good perspective that you see the whole picture and how one little part contributes to the whole thing that's going on. And maturity is about unity and knowing that you're playing your part in something that's much bigger than you. But that if you didn't play your part, the much bigger thing wouldn't hold together. And you're glad about that because you want the bigger thing to hold together. The other thing Paul says is, you're just like everybody else. You're just like a human being, I think was the translation that Paul read. And there's a sense in which the Apostle Paul wants us to not be just like everybody else. But go to my next slide. Thanks, Anne. See, if Christians were just identical to all other people, following Christ would seem effectively to be meaningless. If we're just like everybody else, why follow Christ? What's the difference? Now, this is challenging for us because part of our humanity really wants to be just like everybody else. We like to fit in, don't we? I like to fit in. I've spent my whole life working out how to best fit in, not to be left out, not to be the reject of the group. That's very much ingrained in most of us. And I think it's worth acknowledging that part of our humanity. We like to fit in. We kind of like to be like everybody else. And if we were left to drift, our instincts would shape us as if to be much like everybody else, as much as possible like everybody else. It usually takes a conscious and deliberate act to be different. It's a little bit like swimming against the tide at times. There's a passage in the New Testament somewhere that says something like, you shall know the truth and the truth will make you odd. And in our time at the moment, that probably is a real statement. If you're interested in truth, well, you're really the odd person out. And it's very hard to swim against the tide when everybody else is saying, no, that's not important. This is important. To stand. And that word that Paul uses often in his letters, to stand, comes into critical focus. Because Paul's heart desire for the Corinthians and for every person that he met and brought into this story of Christ was that they would be mature in Christ. Thanks, Anne. Paul's view is that Apollos has a role, and Cephas has a role, and Paul has a role, and Phil has a role, and James has a role, and Paul has a role, and Joy has a role, and everybody has a role to play. We each have our particular gifts and skills, and we bring them to the whole, and we offer them to the whole, not the digging in the ground hole, but the holistic whole. Words are funny, aren't they? There are no territorial claims to be made. You can't claim this is my ministry because it's never your ministry. It's always Christ's ministry and you're helping out. It's always Christ's ministry and you're either helping or you're not helping. All territory belongs to Jesus. We are simply workers in his territory. And that's the mature response. Could you flick the next one? What's that a picture of? Oh, it's a pig in mud. Now, why has he got a pig in mud up there? Because the mature disciple is not looking for rewards that are extrinsic. The mature disciple loves doing ministry like a pig loves to be in mud. You don't have to pay the pig to go into the mud. You don't have to cajole it or persuade it. You know that expression, like a pig in mud? It's the very way of saying that's where they love to be. That's their natural, joyful environment. That's where they're at home. That's where they're relaxed and fulfilled. And the mature disciple finds their reward in their ministry. Not their payment for their ministry, and not even the thank yous they get for it, but in doing it, in seeing the part they play make the little incremental differences. And sometimes they're very small, but better to small than none at all. To make your little offering, to do the thing that is faithful and enable the change in the kingdom. That is the mature disciple's heart passion. I remember when I was, my first kind of career job was a graphic artist. I love doing artwork. I do it now, every now and then, when I can, for church stuff. And I worked for a guy who was fairly dysfunctional, I think it's fair to say. He was going through a marriage breakup at the time. It was his own little business. He had another employee who did bookwork, and he took me on because he was getting a lot of work. And basically, I became his slave because I was a yes man and I wanted to please him. It was my first real job in the industry. It was hard to get jobs in the industry. And so I did everything he asked me to do. And he would never thank me. He would bark commands at me, and I would do them. And I was paid to do them. That was my job. But I remember thinking one time when I was just about jacked with this, I thought, I would give up a week's wages just to hear you say, "Thank you, David, job well done." I so wanted that sense of appreciation. The primary reward of the kingdom worker is those words from the Lord. Well done, good and faithful servant. It's not your pay, it's not what happens around you, it's those words, well done, good and faithful servant. If you work the work of the kingdom for any other reward, I suspect you will be disappointed. I suspect you probably also haven't realized the eternal value of what you're doing, because that is the reward itself. And that comes to the final point, which is, it's easy to miss this, but being involved in the kingdom work is an incredible privilege. It's an incredible thing to be involved in something that will change a person's life for all eternity and in ways that are eternally rich. There, I believe, is nothing more exciting or better you could give your life to. Sometimes the complexities and vagaries of relationships get to us. God doesn't always deliver in the way that we are expecting God will deliver. Life takes all sorts of turns that were not in our game plan, not in our book, as it were. Yet nothing is more life-affirming, life-giving than the call of the kingdom. Nothing is more challenging and nothing is more fulfilling. So there are many stages of maturity. Can I do the last one? Bing. Just like growing up as a person, growing up in your faith, you start off immature. You have to, and you need milk. To try and chew on a steak is not only silly, it's downright dangerous. So with yourself and with others, try and suss out what's the appropriate level of maturity here? What's going on here? How do we respond to this person? Or what expectations should I have on myself or others in relation to their maturity? Because care needs to be appropriate to the stage of the journey that a person is on. There's no judgment in this. And even Paul, when he writes to the Corinthians, he's not judging, he's describing. He's saying, don't be silly about yourself. See what's really going on. The indicators are obvious once you've got eyes to see them. The mature want to build the body of believers. It's a really good litmus test. Is what's happening here building the believers? Or is it just about one person's agenda? The mature resist the urge to be constrained by the expectations of the crowd. They're not just like everybody else. They're prepared to be a bit different. They're prepared to be odd. The mature get on with the task. There's many more exciting things or easier things to be done, but there's nothing better, nothing more important, nothing more fulfilling. Their reward is in the work they do, in the doing of the work, in the pleasure, like the strong man delights to run his race. It's in the work of the kingdom that we delight. We delight to see people change and transformed. And that is the privilege, the joy, the thing that keeps our heart buoyed and keeps us going. Let's pray. Lord, in a world that values so many different things and that overlooks the values of eternity, it is sometimes hard to believe that this might be true. That really those simple things that are right before us, that person to our left or right, to respond in love and grace and understanding, to stand with and to include all the things that are the powerful dynamics of your kingdom. Those are the best things. Against these things there is no law. And in one sense, there is no price in our world. We don't know how to value them. They cost simply us giving ourselves to you for your purposes, to the glory of your name. And that's what we want to do. Amen.